Hello, and welcome to our first webinar of the new academic year. My name is Judith Hicks, and I'm going to take you an overview of the process the board goes through when they recruit a senior executive leader. Towards the end of the webinar, we will go through a list of processes and guides and support for all boards so that you can access beyond this webinar. We will also be sending out the slides to all attendees. A word about terminology. Throughout the webinar, I will talk about senior executive leaders and governing boards as a catch-all. And we will use that throughout. Where there is a difference between maintain and academies, I will make that clear. Please feel free to use the chat function throughout the webinar. We will collate all your questions and write out to you with answers after the webinar is finished. So, the purpose of the session and what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes. Very much highlight the need for planning and preparation required by the board. It's so integral that as a board we get that process right. We'll look at the key stages of recruiting a senior executive leader and what's involved in that. Draw your attention to the legal considerations that boards must be mindful of when they're recruiting a senior executive leader. And finally, deep down into those key elements of the selection stage process on what to be mindful of. Before we start, a little word about COVID. Although there's no prescriptive guidance about recruiting senior executive leaders, boards, as always, must be mindful of the existing guidance and be paramount that safety of all involved, so staff, anyone who's applying for the role, governors and pupils, is key throughout the whole process. We know through our work with boards and local authorities that throughout lockdown, virtual interviews have been used very successfully. But boards must almost consider their selection activities that they're going to participate in and make sure they're compliant with all the guidelines. We also know that when it comes to the end of that process and the board is ready to approve the panel's decision, that can be done far more efficiently through a video conferencing call. So, planning and preparation. In my work with boards, one of the things that boards often underestimate is the amount of time it can take. A panel should be prepared for this to be the main point of business throughout the whole academic year, and there is much planning and preparation to do. It's so important that boards take time to consider at the very beginning of the process. They may do this independently, or they may feel that that's better supported by an external facilitator. But it's always thinking about, is it right to recruit like for like, or do we need more than this in the new role? Some questions boards should ask themselves is, where will this fit in our current organisation chart? Is it likely to change? And how will a new role come in and complement existing skills and experience within the structure? Will the board take on the role of the lead professional and therefore fulfil the statutory obligations? If the Board of Trustees are recruiting a CEO in a MAT, they must therefore consider the role of accounting officer. And now maybe more on an operational point. What are the immediate challenges for a new role person coming into this role for this particular school or this particular trust? When we talk about planning and managing our resources, first and foremost, we must always think about time. It is the most key of our resources, and we think carefully how to get the best use out of that. Think about our preferred start date. Now, a really popular start date is the 1st of September. But in the case of a serving head teacher, that will mean that they have to give their notice in on the 30th of April. So it's worth considering the planning and the timing that's going to have to consideration to take that date to make that work. It also means that the spring term will be a really popular time for recruitment. And again, boards should think about term times and holidays. Recruitment is not cheap. And boards almost must consider their budget and what's involved in that budget. Things that you could include are cost of external support. Many boards find that they benefit from having some kind of external consultant and support throughout that process. So that may involve looking at the job advert. The job advert, the cost of it is not cheap, but it may well be included in a package. And again, boards must think about that. You must think about the salary range for the new job and factor in a sustainability part in terms of future pay increases or any pension contributions. When we talk about external independent expertise, there are many ways that a board can commission that kind of support. Local authorities often offer it as part of their traded package, and so do dioceses. We also know that professional associations, such as the Association of School and College Leaders, offer a variety of support available to boards. There are also independent education recruitment consultants. Boards absolutely must do their research, consider their budget, and decide what type of expertise they need and how that will fit within the budget. So let's look at that timeline in a little bit more detail. As someone much more famous than me once said, start with the end in mind. And if we go right down to the bottom there and look at the start date and use the example I used previously, that's a 4-month notice period. So suddenly you can see where you get that 9-month timeline from. When it comes to making the offer, always allow at least a week. It may be your first choice candidate declines and you then have to go to your second. So always factor in some contingency time for that. As I've already mentioned, any panel decision has to be ratified by the board, and while a video conferencing can be more efficient, you still need to have time factored in. Interviews, it's really important that those are planned because you have to have agreed the date for the interviews and be able to publish those in the advert. So again, thinking about that and however that's a 1-day, a 2-day, or in the case of a CEO for a MAT, it may well be a 3-day process. When we think about shortlisting, absolutely allow 1 week because as members of the panel, you shortlist individually, but you also then come together as a panel to agree your collective decision for who to bring forward for an interview. Application deadlines always have a date and always have a time and a deadline for submitting applications. Most potential candidates would like to visit a school, and obviously in these COVID times, that's going to take even more careful planning than it did before, but it's always worth doing that and always allowing extra time for it. When we advertise a position, it's really good to have that job advert run live for at least 4 weeks. And again, that's a big chunk of your timeline. A professionally designed, engaging recruitment pack that's really going to encourage applicants to apply will take time to design and produce. So again, 4 weeks for that. And then we're back where we started in terms of the board's deliberations, planning, considerations, and whether that's using an external facilitator or not. So this example is based on a serving head teacher's notice period. It's worth mentioning that if you end up appointing someone who's a deputy head or a head teacher who's not working, or a head teacher who's currently employed by a school abroad and is intending to return to the UK, then their notice periods will be different. And boards must ensure that they are really clear on individual candidates' notice periods. But these are an example of a serving head teacher. And as you can see, again, those are extensive, and it's easy to see where your timeline stacks up when you look at those notice periods. The role of a governing board in a maintained school is very prescriptive, and we must have head teachers, and the local authority as the legal employer must be informed of all of those key stages, and you must tell the local authority who you intend to bring forward for an interview. All the positions have to be advertised, and you must have a selection panel of at least 3 governors. Our top tip there is actually to have 5. In these uncertain times, people suddenly can become unavailable. So it's always good to have 2 in reserve for that. Candidates have to be interviewed face-to-face, but virtual interviews are fine. And lastly, but probably one of the most important parts, is one of your panel members must have completed safer recruitment training. It's worth considering that early on, because if you decide that none of your governors have got a current safer recruitment certificate, you'll need to arrange that training. Again, factor that into your planning. Academies do have greater freedom when it comes to decide their leadership structure. However, the details will be outlined in their articles of association and a scheme of delegation. If you have a situation where you're appointing a CEO for a multi-academy trust, then that panel would be entirely of trustees. However, in the case of a principal or a head of school, you may well have a mix of members of the local academy committee and trustees as well. Safer recruitment guidance should always be viewed as best practice, and it's worth noting that the Equality Act and the associated public sector equality duty apply to all state-funded schools, irrespective of their status. So when we look at those key stages of recruitment, there are 5 key stages. Agreeing that person specification, that job description, that is absolutely critical, because we go back to those selection criteria that we list in the person specification when we think about questions, interview stage, and indeed when we agree activities for those candidates to undertake. There must be really clear links back to the questions that we ask, the activities that we undertake, and our ability to assess competence against those success criteria. We must advertise, and as I said before, it's not cheap, but we must get that right in terms of an eye-catching advert and the timeline and the live advert. Shortlisting is so important, and it's important that we do that individually and as a panel and purely against the success criteria. Selection day activities do need some thought and consideration as to what the best way to go with, and again, boards may find that the external expertise is useful at this stage. When we come to make the appointment, we often draw on HR expertise to ensure that our contract, our offer letter, and our terms and conditions are all issued in accordance with regulations. We don't often think of schools as businesses, but this is one of those rare times when we need to sell our school and sell our organisation to attract people's attention. So when you think about your advert, there's key stages. We want to draw attention to that advert. So we need to think about the size of the advert, the place on the page, the colour, the school logo. We need to get people's interest. So what's the headline on your advert? The school name will play a factor there, and so will the salary range. The next stage is to generate that desire to apply for this role. We need a vision for your school, a plan, an opportunity, make it clear to people how they can add value to your organisation. And then we need a clear call to action. How do they apply, interview dates, and the deadline? A word about shortlisting at this stage. It's absolutely imperative that the panel are able to meet throughout the whole process to shortlist as well as actually on the interview day. As I've already said, it must be strictly against the selection criteria that you've already agreed in your person specification, and no other characteristics should be taken into account. We know that some boards used anonymised applications, and we know that that minimises unconscious bias. We shortlist individually, and then we come together as a panel to agree our final list. And always at this stage, start the reference requests and the background checks. So these things take time, so it's good to get those things started early. When we look at our legal considerations, safeguarding is absolutely paramount. It should run throughout your entire process, and think of it almost like the letters of Blackpool running through a stick of seaside rock. It should be at front and centre of everything we do. I've already said that one panel must be safer recruitment trained, but also think basics. Check with your eligibility to work in the UK. Make sure your application forms are completed and signed and references have been requested. Governing boards have the responsibility for ensuring that applicants have not been barred from working with children, and absolutely ensure that your safeguarding statement is in that job advert, and that you then select some safeguarding questions to ask at interview stage. Boards must be fully aware of their responsibilities under the Equality Act. The Equality Act makes it illegal for any employer to discriminate, either directly or indirectly, against an employee or a potential employee, and that's why it's so important for recruitment, based on any of those 9 protected characteristics. As you can see, it's so important that boards understand this, and then they make sure that the recruitment process is fair and open. The requirement to have a head teacher is stipulated in the Education Act 2002 for all maintained schools. For academies, it is the Trust Articles Association that would be the main point of reference, but it's the independent school standard regulations that contain standards about the suitability of someone who can be a senior executive leader in a trust. The Articles Association will also point out who is responsible for the appointment of a principal or multi-academy trust CEO. In the Department for Education's model articles, that responsibility normally lies with the trustees. Schools with religious character, it's always worth remembering that governors of voluntary aided schools are able to give preference to candidates when it comes to recruitment, remuneration and promotion to those who share the religious beliefs. Boards of voluntary control schools should always give careful consideration to the wording of the advert, because we need to ensure that the advert is attractive to a maximum pool of applicants. The diocese could and will always be involved in the recruitment, and they will support boards at every stage. As always, academies should always be guided by their articles of association. So the elements of a selection stage. As I said before, always going back to that person's specification and always ensuring that your criteria can be objectively assessed. Look at your activities really carefully and decide whether the panel or whether an external independent expert will be able to observe, assess and feed back. So an example there might well be a lesson observation. So if you want candidates to go to observe a lesson and then to give feedback to that class teacher, you're going to need an expert who can watch that process, assess what the candidate says, observe, and then feed that back to you as a panel in terms of their competence. Planning the selection activities is critical, and we always recommend using a matrix with the candidate, the time, and all the activities carefully planned out. When you're doing a 1, 2, or even 3 day, in the case of a multi-academy CEO day, processes and as it goes through, the timings need to be managed really carefully. Also, if you are doing that 2 and 3 day process, you really need to consider how and at what point you will decide who is assessed to go through to the next stage of the process. So this isn't an exhaustive list of activities, but it's good to give you some idea of the kind of things that boards tend to use. So we've already talked about that lesson observation and how that would work. But as a panel, you may well decide that actually you want to hear a presentation from your candidates and you need to agree the title and the duration. Many panels decide that they want candidates to look at the school data and do an analysis of that data and then present their findings. In these times of budget constraint, another popular activity is absolutely looking at the budget and asking candidates to analyse that and come up with their recommendations and next steps. You may well decide to do a student panel or some question and answer sessions with your school council. And obviously in these COVID times, that may be a virtual process. But again, you will need to think about that as a panel. The students will need to be selected and a brief agreed. You may decide to see how you want to see candidates perform in a team meeting or leading a meeting. So a mock senior leadership team meeting may be an option for you. And a safeguarding scenario, a written scenario that we give to candidates with a student that's coming in first thing in the morning and this has happened, and what would their next steps be and what would they do? Always try to manage the day, the flow of the day, so consider maybe a tour of the school and build in lots of rest periods and lunch periods. It can be an incredibly tiring process, both for the candidates and the panel. So it's really important to manage that process carefully. When we talk about the actual interview, we start to think about those questions. And I've always said all your questions should always link back to that selection criteria that you listed in your person specification. But when we start, we open up with really broad, open questions. Tell me about, how have you? And we narrow that down to think, well, expand on to what extent. And then if we need to go deeper and understand where candidates are developing their knowledge or where they need to express evidence, and we want to be really clear of their competence, we might then start asking some more probing questions. Well, why do you think that was? It's always about the questions and why you're asking them. So it's really important when we decide what questions we're asking and which member of the panel is going to ask them, that we understand the purpose of that question. Which criteria does it link back to? And what are the answers that you're looking for? Panel should actively listen throughout the whole of the interview, which can be a really tiring undertaking, but it's so important because sometimes it's about hearing what's not said as much as what is said. And we're always listening to understand, not necessarily to respond. And think about your follow-up questions and plan those appropriately. When we come to the stage of appointment, we make that final decision. In some cases, it can be very straightforward. There's a really strong standout candidate. However, in other cases, there can be more prolonged discussion and deliberation. So it's always good to say to candidates, thank you very much, and send them on their way. Don't make them sit and wait, because those discussions can go on. You can always inform candidates the next day. In some cases, unfortunately, despite everyone's best efforts, you are unable to appoint. And while that's hugely disappointing, it is also the right decision. It is far better to have a vacancy than to have someone in position who struggles and you end up in a poor performance situation. Whatever the outcome, you will always have unsuccessful candidates. And it's so important that unsuccessful candidates are thanked for their time and effort, because it is a huge effort to apply for a job, that they go away with a really positive impression of your organisation as an employer, and they're offered the chance of feedback. Feedback generally will be from a CEO in a multi-academy trust, but it may be from the chair of governors or a panel member. If you decide that you want to give unsuccessful candidates feedback from your external consultant, that's absolutely great, but really think about the cost of that, because there will be a fee for that. As boards, we need to always be mindful of our role of the employer. And again, this is where our HR expertise can come in to make sure that we do all of the things we need to do as an employer. And whether the process is successful or not, we should absolutely always aim to evaluate that process. Any undertaking that has taken most of the academic year and a sizable part of our budget warrants an evaluation. We need to understand what went well, what didn't go so well, what would we do differently, and really learn from that process. So in summary, always allow adequate time for the whole process. It can take up to 9 months, and your planning at the beginning of the process is absolutely critical. Give really careful consideration to resourcing your recruitment process. You may need some kind of external independent expertise, and boards should factor that in for their budget and also for their planning. Really be mindful and be clear and understand your legal requirements, whether you're a maintained school or an academy. Ensure your safeguarding is prominent throughout. And manage the process diligently. The process is long, but it also has many key milestones and deadlines. So panel members will need to manage that process very carefully to ensure that the process runs smoothly, that deadlines are adhered to. Some further resources. If you are an NGA member, there is guidance in our Knowledge Centre on recruiting a head teacher and documents that you can access. We're really excited that next month we'll be publishing 2 new Learning Link modules, part 1 and part 2, really focusing in on recruiting a senior executive leader. These will also include the new head teacher standards, which are due to be published next month, and NGA has been involved heavily in the development of those standards. So we're really excited about that being launched next month. The Department for Education has guidance on gov.uk, which you're absolutely free to access. And as I mentioned before, ASCL, the Association of School and College Leaders, have a professional development support package. So if you go onto their website, you can access that and find out what they can offer you. As always, our NGA COVID-19 recovery guidance is available on our website. For those of you that don't currently subscribe to Learning Link and are interested in accessing the new Senior Executive Leader recruitment module when it comes out, as you can see, the subscription rates are competitive. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch with our team to find out more. And I'll leave you with a quote from a former CEO and chair of General Electric. I am convinced that nothing we do is more important than recruiting and developing people. At the end of the day, you bet on people, not on strategies. Thanks for participating and enjoy the rest of your evening.